keep these types of events going on. That said, I'd like to welcome to PNP Live Simon Hall. A rising star, Mr. Hall captures the spirit of the 1960s in the 10 days that revolutionized the Cold War, Fidel Castro's visit to New York. New York City in September of 1960. Fidel Castro, known as a champion of the oppressed, scourge of colonialism and leftist revolutionary, arrives for the opening of the UN General Assembly. His visit to the UN represented a golden opportunity to make his mark on the world stage. Fidel's shock arrival in Harlem is met with a rapturous reception from the local African-American community. He holds court from the iconic Hotel Theresa as a succession of world leaders, Black freedom fighters, and counterculture luminaries, everyone from Nikita Khrushchev to Gamal Abdel Nasser, Malcolm X, and Allen Ginsberg come calling. Then during his landmark address to the UN General Assembly, one of the longest speeches in the organization's history, he promotes the politics of anti-imperialism with a fervor and an audacity that makes him an icon of the 60s. In this unforgettable slice of modern history, Simon Hall reveals how these 10 days were a foundational moment in the trajectory of the Cold War, a turning point in the history of anti-colonial struggle, and a launching pad for the social, cultural, and political tumult of the decade that followed. Mr. Hall will be in conversation today with Lillian Guerra, a professor of Cuban history at the University of Florida. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Simon Hall, and for this wonderful book, which is a really timely contribution, I think, in ways that we shall discover throughout the course of this conversation. I want to ask you first why you decided to write this book and what you think it's most fundamentally about.
I wanted to write this book because I thought it was a great story to tell. The 15th General Assembly of the United Nations is one of the great diplomatic set pieces of the post-war period, and we have this extraordinary cast of characters that all gather in New York in the middle of September 1960, and they do so at a kind of key moment in the history of the Cold War and the history of the decolonization movement, and at the start of a decade that is going to prove to be one of the most kind of extraordinary and vibrant and divisive and consequential in the history of the 20th century. And so I thought that this story was you got a great cast of characters. It's taking place at a great moment in history. It's taking place against a really fascinating backdrop that you've got New York City, you've got the UN headquarters, you've got Harlem. And it's a fun story. So the more you look at it, the more kind of outrageous and extraordinary it becomes. And you've got this very concentrated period of time, a 10 or 11 day period, where you can use that as a frame really to talk about key moments in the history of the Cold War, the history of the anti-colonial movement, the history of the 1960s, the history of the African-American freedom struggle. So it was a combination really of kind of a really fun and entertaining story, but one which enabled some big historical themes and questions and developments to kind of be addressed in a way that I thought would be quite accessible and entertaining and kind of fun to do.
Mm-hmm. In so many ways, what makes September of 1960 a key moment in world history and in the history of Latin America and what was then the colonized world of Southeast Asia and Africa is the fact that it's like a political crossroads, what you just described. Cuba also was at a key juncture. So September, when Fidel comes to New York, is only a month after the Cuban revolutionary government had nationalized foreign businesses, and it had started by nationalizing foreign oil, but they still had not nationalized the economy per se. That would be November. And so we're at a moment where communism has not been embraced. We were sort of almost at the key moment of anti-imperialist nationalism as an expression of the government in Cuba, and then of the support for the revolution. So because we're historians, we don't think anything is inevitable. And so if you put yourself in September of 1960, as this book does, decolonization is just starting as a global phenomenon, as an intellectual movement. The civil rights movement has not peaked. The Cold War in Latin America hasn't really begun. The United States has not even invaded Cuba yet, as it would with the CIA-directed Bay of Pigs invasion. So the Cuban Revolution has a huge impact on all three of those phenomena. And the book really begs the question of what you think Fidel Castro's goals were in going to New York in September of 1960. I mean, who were his audiences at the United Nations?
Yeah, so I mean, Fidel, I think, has a number of reasons for wanting to go to this General Assembly, this 15th General Assembly. Partly because it is taking place at this extraordinary moment when a whole train of things are kind of are sort of in flux. I mean, 1960 is known as the year of Africa because it's the year that more than a dozen newly independent African nations join the United Nations. And Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, has made a big effort to try to persuade as many leaders of the newly independent nations as possible to come to New York. Because he wants to see the UN as a kind of a driver for the anti-colonial movement, and Fidel kind of wants to be part of that. He wants to be in on that, on the action, if you like. So I think one of the reasons that Fidel goes to New York is to kind of make the point that Cuba and the Cuban Revolution is part of this broader anti-imperial struggle. He also thinks it's going to be a great platform for him to, if you like, publicize, celebrate his own revolution, the achievements of his revolution, and its kind of global impact, its global reach. I also think he's kind of keen to make mischief and have some fun. So I think that's another reason why he goes, that he sees an opportunity to kind of sort of take on the Yankees on their own turf. Really, is sort of irresistible.
Mm-hmm. So I also think that one of the contributions of the book is, for a lot of us, it's not unknown to us already, but for those who are just discovering this history, the visual impact of the Cuban Revolution, of its representatives, of those who would join, in Fidel's visit and be part of this extraordinarily historic moment. They had, that visual narrative is very well documented in your book, and it's a lovely companion to the text, which is eloquent and very easy to read. It's a lovely micro history that is representative of this macro history, and really the best micro histories do that, and they launch us into thinking about how what happens later is anchored in very peculiar moments, very important moments that in that moment perhaps was not recognized as such. In this moment, it's very clear from your book that people recognize this mattered and that Fidel Castro matters and the revolution matters. So to get back to my original point, there is a particular aesthetic to the revolutionaries that now has become so mainstream that, half the boys in my classes have, Fidel Castro beards, in one way or another. And it's not just because of COVID, but there is a particular aesthetic and a beauty almost to that aesthetic. It's very bohemian. It ruptures with so many expectations about who Latin Americans are. It's so appealing. And the fact that it's anchored in the Harlem moment matters as well. So I wonder if you could describe what you think of as Fidel Castro and these revolutionaries aesthetic, and what you think the impact of that was.
Yeah, he's kind of, I don't know if he's the original hipster, but he's definitely seen as a sort of a hipster revolutionary, kind of bohemian sort of beatnik style. The very fact that they're constantly wearing their olive green military fatigues, I think, is helps to kind of, and almost all of them have these beards. It kind of creates this very particular revolutionary aesthetic. And it was an aesthetic that kind of captured the imagination of lots of people in the United States and further afield in Western Europe as well. I think particularly at a younger generation. So Fidel's style, as well as what he's trying to do, or in 1959, 1960, appeals to a new generation of college students. This generation that's going to go on to kind of create this huge student movement and this very vibrant kind of counterculture. And it's such a contrast with Eisenhower, right, the US president in his final months in office. And there's a sort of, I think it's kind of perfect coincidence really that on the evening of Thursday, the 22nd of September, Eisenhower is having dinner with a few mates, male friends, a kind of stag dinner at the Waldorf Astoria. And one of the guests is the chairman of Augusta National, the very sort of famous and also very stuffy and conservative golf club. And at the very same time that Eisenhower is sitting down to dinner with these kind of conservative white guys in suits, Fidel is partying in the ballroom of the Hotel Theresa with, Robert F. Williams, the Black freedom fighter, Allen Ginsberg, the beat poet, a whole kind of succession of cultural radicals, political thinkers, and it's all very informal, it's slightly shabby. We'd probably call it now shabby chic surroundings. It's just a total contrast, and I think it helps to sort of symbolize, the way in which the 60s are coming along, and they're going to sweep away this more formal, rather staid, slightly conformist culture that's been associated with the 50s, and we're going to get a new, slightly more anarchic and more kind of informal style of politics. So I think that's a really kind of telling scene in the story and in the book, actually.
Yeah, the kids who were participating in the civil rights protests, whether they were Black or they were white, they were wearing, their Sunday best. They were showing up in suits and ties, and that was true through, at least the early years of the 60s. So the shock of Fidel's informality, I think, is very meaningful, as you say. So why do you think, well, first you should explain the sort of facts of why Harlem, because that was not supposed to be where the Cuban delegation ended up. And so tell us why Harlem, and then tell us about the extraordinary reception that African Americans provided Fidel and his delegation once they moved there.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that the US government was very unhappy that Fidel was coming to New York as head of the Cuban delegation. And they made it pretty clear that they, although they had no alternative but to allow him to come to the city because of the UN General Assembly, that he was definitely not a guest of the United States government. And they placed certain restrictions on his movement. So they said that he basically couldn't leave the island of Manhattan during his stay. And the Cubans found it very difficult to get hotel accommodations. They didn't have a large UN mission building in New York. And they couldn't stay outside of Manhattan sort of rent a large sort of a house or something. So they found it very hard to get hotel accommodations, and it started to become a bit of a diplomatic embarrassment. And ultimately, the State Department and the UN put pressure on Edward Spatz, who was the owner of the Shelburne Hotel in Midtown, to accommodate the Cuban delegation. But he did so sort of under sufferance, really. He made it very clear that he didn't really want the Cubans there. He didn't care much for Fidel's politics. He made sure that a huge American flag was flying over his hotel, just to kind of, really show his American patriotism. And he told members of the press that he hated Fidel. So it's not surprising, really, that the stay at the Shelburne was short and definitely not sweet. So after less than 24 hours at the Shelburne, there's a big row that blows up over money. But basically, that the owners asked for an additional $10,000 as a security deposit because they're hearing all of these rumors about the Cubans plucking and cooking chickens in their hotel rooms and stubbing out cigars on the furniture and stuff. So anyway, Fidel storms out of the Shelburne, goes over to the UN headquarters, harangues the Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, threatens to sleep either on the sofas or in the UN Rose Garden, and eventually they find alternative accommodation in the Hotel Theresa, which is, it's a wonderful building. It's a landmark building right in the heart of Harlem, and so very late on the night of September the 19th, Fidel and his it's about 80 or so members of the delegation, they rock up at the Hotel Theresa, and they're met with huge crowds who've heard the rumors that Fidel is on his way. So the hotel is surrounded by crowds of supporters, some of them Cuban Americans, many of them, most of them African Americans. And, within just, I don't know, about half an hour of checking in, his first guest arrives, and it's Malcolm X, and that kind of sets the tone really for the rest of his stay there. And yeah, he receives this tremendous reception from many thousands of people who are living in Harlem. And there are a few reasons for that. I think one is that within weeks of taking power in 1959, Fidel had committed Cuba to eliminating racial discrimination. He passed a series of laws outlawing segregation in, on beaches and in hotels and in private members' clubs and so on. And then had proceeded to sort of invite African American delegations over to see for themselves what was going on in Cuba. And this was at a time when, the civil rights movement is beginning to really pick up steam in the United States, but the approach of the Eisenhower administration is very cautious. That Eisenhower keeps saying, I believe in racial equality, but you have to be patient. You have to do these things slowly. You can't change the established racial order overnight. Well, in Cuba, at least on the surface, and apparently that's exactly what's happened. So the Cuban Revolution generates a lot of excitement for many African Americans who kind of see it as a possibility of how of a different kind of world that can be created. He also gets a good reception in Harlem in September 1960, just because he's making mischief and he's causing a lot of embarrassment for the State Department. And there's a rumor that goes around Harlem that the American government was so keen to prevent him from moving to the Hotel Theresa that they offered to put him up for free in the Commodore Hotel in Manhattan instead. So yeah, he gets this tremendous response, and also it's just the fact that he's gone to Harlem. World leaders on the whole, they don't stay in Harlem. Harlem is an area that's kept hidden away from statesmen, from visiting dignitaries, and by going there and by being happy to be in Harlem, he's also paying Harlem a compliment. So that goes down well too.
Mm-hmm. It behooves me to say that as a Cuban historian, clearly one of the things that resulted from this was a radicalization of Black folks in Cuba. I mean, they had already, in most cases, jumped onto the process of confronting racism directly, as you say, as of March of 1959. But this was never part of, it seems, Fidel's original kind of vision. So he had neglected to bring any members of his government who might have been non-white. I mean, it wasn't until he moved to Harlem that he very famously had to call on Juan Almeida, the only non-white member of his inner circle, to come to New York, and he showed up immediately. So that means in many ways that, that again, it stokes the fires of the importance of the moment, that Fidel suddenly has a whole new dimension of understanding of his presence, as do those who are his audiences. But it's also not just about Fidel, as you bring up. There's this, small man named Nikita Khrushchev, who is also there. And he's relatively new on the scene. Nobody really knows exactly what direction he's taking. So, at least among the American public, Stalin has died in 1954. He has this early initial launching of his international reputation as a critic of Stalinism, etc. But there he is, and Fidel stands at least a foot taller, one of the pictures in your book shows us. So how do you see Khrushchev's role here, and how did he interact with Fidel? You know, and they are both icons, but, you know, Khrushchev and Cuba, I mean, rather, the Soviet Union power, its power, and Khrushchev's power is so much greater than, you know, it is the rival to the United States. So how is that negotiated? What happens there?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the great things about the story is that you have these two characters who are both larger than life, and they're both very hard to work out. They're both sort of enigmas in a way. Khrushchev is a fascinating and compelling sort of personality. And, you know, just a year before, he'd been to the United States on a tour of the country, basically, during 1959, a tour which had gone really well. And it seemed as though there might be some sort of thaw in the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And he'd had a very pleasant meeting with Eisenhower at Camp David, for example. And he'd been greeted by huge crowds, you know, keen to see the Soviet leader in the flesh, as it were. And then in 1st of May 1960, a U-2 flight over Soviet airspace had been shot down. Its pilot, Gary Powers, captured alive. The US had put out a sort of false story that it was a weather aircraft that had strayed off course, whereupon Khrushchev reveals the wreckage, reveals Gary Powers, and lashes out really at the kind of treachery of the United States. And Soviet-US relations, you know, deteriorate very, very quickly. And Khrushchev goes back to New York in 1960, just a year or so after he'd previously been in the city, this time sort of determined to kind of take the battle to the Americans. He turns up in a very belligerent mood, and kind of bursting really to do battle, as it were. And he has two personalities on show during his visit. He stays until the end of until towards the end of October. He's there. At one point, he threatens to stay until Christmas, which is great. I mean, but he has one side of his personality which is jovial, jocular, charming. He holds all these impromptu press conferences from the balcony of the Soviet mission on Park Avenue, kind of joshes with the press. And that's very much on show when he's meeting with Fidel. So, you know, he makes a point of going to the Theresa. The Cubans offered to go down to the Soviet mission for the meeting. And he's like, no, we're going to go to Harlem. Also to cause the maximum embarrassment to the United States, and as well to show our solidarity both with the African-American freedom struggle and with you know, embattled Cuba. And, you know, he goes to the Theresa, and he affects not to mind the dilapidated state of the hotel and the mess in Fidel's hotel suite. And then, you know, they emerge onto the sidewalk outside, you know, beaming, hugging, embracing. It's a slightly awkward hug because, as you say, Fidel is very tall and quite thin, and Khrushchev is neither of those things. So it's an awkward embrace, but it's clearly a friendly one. And later on in the day, when the news journalists are saying to Khrushchev, you know, is Fidel a communist? He sort of said, I don't know, but I'm a Fidelista, you know. And a few days later, Fidel goes for dinner at the Soviet mission, and he, partly because he's a bit sort of lackadaisical and partly because of the traffic, he turns up 40 minutes late. But Khrushchev pretends this doesn't matter. He doesn't mind it at all. It's fine. Everything's, you know, friendly. So he's kind of super friendly with Fidel and with the Cubans, and it's kind of the beginning of the kind of the romance between the Soviet Union and revolutionary Cuba. And that sort of behavior contrasts very much with Khrushchev's behavior in the General Assembly, where he's constantly kind of glowering, gesticulating, banging on the desk, shouting. When Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, gives his speech on the 29th of September, he takes offence at some comments, I think, about disarmament, and Khrushchev sort of leaps to his feet and starts shouting, and Macmillan, you know, diffuses the situation very nicely by just asking for the comments to be translated, which makes everybody sort of chuckle, and Khrushchev sort of sits down. But then a few weeks later, he famously takes off his shoe and bangs it on his desk when a Filipino member of the General Assembly accuses the Soviet Union of practicing colonialism in Eastern Europe. So he has these two sides, right? The jocular and the belligerent. But one of his main aims in going to the General Assembly, he appoints himself head of the Soviet delegation to give, so that he has the right to go and participate, is that he wants to kind of help to shape and to lead this kind of what he views as an anti-imperialist movement, which is going to be, joining together the Soviet Union with the newly independent states of Africa and the main leaders of the global South. And he wants to take this opportunity to kind of, these new nations are sort of up for grabs in the Cold War, and he wants to kind of either win their allegiance or to prevent them from just sort of signing up behind the US side.
Mm-hmm. So there are a number of other major figures, especially for those who are part of the Third World, and they include Nehru and Nasser and Nkrumah. Some of us may not know exactly who they are, although I'm sure their names sound familiar. So perhaps you could tell us, explain who they are, but also tell us how they perceived Fidel Castro, and how they perceived, the relevance of Cuba with respect to their own national goals in that moment.
Yeah, so Nehru, the Indian Prime Minister, he meets with Fidel at the Hotel Theresa. He later says that the Americans were very cross with him for doing this. They would much rather he hadn't gone and met with Fidel. But Nehru is of the opinion that he kind of had to meet him because his aim was to try to meet with everybody who, in his words, were important. So he clearly views Fidel as an important figure, an up-and-coming figure on the world stage, potentially an important force within the so-called non-aligned movement, this movement of countries from the global South that sort of don't take sides in the Cold War. And they get on well. They bond in particular over very intricate debates on how to do land reform, which is maybe not of huge interest to everybody who's listening right now, but certainly for Nehru and Fidel, they kind of pore over the details of that in the hotel suite and get very animated about that. So that meeting goes well. He meets with Nasser. Nasser also goes to the Theresa to meet with him. And the chemistry there is less good. I think that President Nasser, the leader of, it's known then as the United Arab Republic, sort of a fusion of Egypt and Syria. Nasser's made his name in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, when he basically faced down the might of Britain and France to nationalize the Suez Canal and then to hold firm during the military attack on Egypt, ultimately prevailing with the support of the United States. So he's become a huge icon of the anti-imperialist movement, and he was a hero for the Cubans even before they took power in Cuba in 1959. So Fidel is certainly really keen to meet with Nasser. The chemistry is less good. They're very different personalities. Nasser is always immaculately turned out. He's very proper, wears these very sharp suits, has his hair never a hair out of place, and he really doesn't like the surroundings of the Hotel Theresa. It really makes him uncomfortable. And then there's also this problem where he presents Fidel with a beautiful silver tea service as a gift, and Fidel can't hide his disappointment at not being given a crocodile. He says, what about the crocodiles? I thought there were crocodiles in Egypt. And Nasser is like, we've got four crocodiles in Egypt. They're all in the zoo. So that doesn't go quite so well. The meeting with Nkrumah is interesting because Kwame Nkrumah, the leader, at this point now, he's the president of Ghana, which was achieved its independence in 1957. It was symbolically really important because it was the first surrender of European colonial power in sub-Saharan Africa. And so at this point, the late 50s, early 60s, Nkrumah is kind of really one of the most influential leaders of the African anti-colonial struggle. And Fidel pays him the compliment of traveling to meet with him at the Ghanaian mission. The meeting's fine. They have tea and it's all fine. But there's a slight, I think, sense that Nkrumah feels that his thunder has been a little bit stolen because Harlem was a place that Nkrumah knew really well. He'd spent about 10 years studying at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania from the mid-1930s. And he'd spent every summer basically living in Harlem, working in Harlem, going to church in Harlem, attending political meetings in Harlem. So Harlem was kind of his turf, really. A year or so after Ghana had got its independence, he traveled to Harlem and it received a huge reception from the neighborhood. And you get the sort of sense that he's feeling a little bit put out. There's one moment when Fidel brings up the question of racial discrimination, and Nkrumah says, you may not know this, Dr. Castro, but I used to live in Harlem. I remember very much encountering racial discrimination myself in Harlem. The subtext is, you don't need to lecture me about the racial situation in Harlem. This was kind of my turf. A few weeks after Fidel flies back to Havana, Nkrumah does go to Harlem himself. He gives a speech outside the Hotel Theresa. But there's a bit of a sense that it's sort of after the party. He's sort of, his as I say, his sort of thunder's been stolen. So there's interesting sort of personal dynamics in all of these meetings. But for Fidel, the main thing is that he gets photographed with all these guys, and that he's kind of operating at the same level as these icons of the anti-colonial movement, really.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also significant to point out that in the U.S., and you would know better than I because you're a specialist of U.S. history, but in the U.S., the general public's understanding of all of these anti-colonial movements was extremely fragmented. I think it's not until, we have the, as it used to be said, this revolutionary in our backyard or in our front yard, depending on how you perceived it, that there is a catalyzing of a consciousness, either positive, negative, or somewhere in between, among Americans about what is going on. And the whole, it was still anathema to the United States in the classroom, on the streets, that the United States had been an imperial power and was still exercising empire. That's not how we taught and we understood the Monroe Doctrine. It's never discussed that the republics of Latin America were not part of that back in the 1820s, when it was 1825, when it became supposedly foundational to our identity in the hemisphere. So there is a kind of catalyzing of the legitimacy of Fidel, but also there's a catalyzing consciousness in general as to the place of the United States in the world and how other people perceive the United States, as opposed to how most Americans, white Americans, perceived the United States. So that sort of brings me to the question of what you think the impact of Fidel's 10 days in Harlem was, in the long term, and why you think the publication of this book is perhaps timely now or matters now. So those are two separate questions.
Yeah, so I think that the trip does matter. I think that it helps to illustrate the shift in the Cold War from Europe to the global South. So in the 60s and 70s, the focus of the Cold War is primarily going to be in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And I think that comes into focus really during this trip, particularly with the growing closeness between Cuba and the Soviet Union. So, the fact that Fidel and Khrushchev get on so well helps to cement that what's going to be a really important new strategic relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union. And of course, at the same time, it really underscores for the Eisenhower government, the Eisenhower administration, that they can't work with Fidel and that they need to get rid of Fidel's government. So in the weeks after Fidel returns to Cuba, the Eisenhower administration begins really stepping up plans to replace the revolutionary government with a scheme that eventually is implemented by the new Kennedy administration in April 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion, where they basically train a bunch of Cuban exiles and launch this sort of invasion of Cuba in an attempt to overthrow Fidel. I think it's the trip matters also because it does turn out to be a fantastic platform for Fidel to make his mark on the global stage, to operate alongside these other iconic figures of the anti-imperialist movement, and they seem to kind of renew his determination or affirm his determination to ensure that Cuba plays a leading role in this movement for the rest of the 60s. And I think they also, I mean, the racial stuff is really interesting because the civil rights movement, as I say, is entering a critical phase. The student lunch counter sit-ins had taken place. They'd started in the spring, in February of 1960. But it's really important that Fidel goes to Harlem, I think, because the story that the United States like to tell to the world at this point in the Cold War, when it was under pressure from the Soviet Union over the race issue, and at a time when there are new countries in Africa who are sort of where there are hearts and minds to be won. The story that the State Department tells is, yes, there's a racial problem in the United States, but it's confined to the South, largely for historical reasons because of slavery. And guess what? It's in the process of being worked out. We're solving it in a methodical, in a peaceful, in a legal, and in a democratic manner, as mandated by the American Constitution. So, nothing to see here, folks. It's all going to be fine. And you don't need to worry about us being the leader of the free world, as we're not really hypocrites. And by going to Harlem, Fidel shines an international spotlight on poverty, on really poor housing, slumlords, exploitation, segregated schools, police brutality. In the urban north, in America's most famous, arguably most important city, a city which is synonymous in 1960 with post-war American liberalism. So it really undermines that kind of narrative that's being told about the Black freedom struggle in the United States and about the so-called race problem. And the other thing it does is sort of this goes back to the earlier question about the kind of style. It sort of ushers in the 1960s in a way which is kind of slightly anarchic, slightly rebellious. I think it helps to frame the decade as it's going to subsequently unfold as a decade of a decade of sort of revolution, radicalism, and kind of a decade of protest. Publishing it today, I mean, I don't know that there's lots of things you could say about that. I mean, one of the things which is, I think, sobering is that in 1960 the UN really seemed to matter. There was a lot of faith in the UN. I think the fact that all these new countries were joining was seen as a great thing, a great moment of opportunity. We're about to have the 75th General Assembly opening in a week or so time. It's going to be a very different assembly, partly because of the pandemic. Most leaders are going to video in their speeches. I don't think any of them will last 4.5 hours. Let's hope not. But the UN is really struggling to find a role, and it seems to be, irrelevant, I think, in a way that it wasn't in 1960. So that's kind of sobering. The other thing which is depressing is back on the race question, right? We don't need a Fidel Castro to illuminate or expose the racial problem in the United States today. It's being done almost every day on the news with social media. But the kind of problems that that his trip to Harlem kind of revealed, if you like, to the world in 1960, are problems which are still being revealed today, not least ones around police brutality. So, I like to think that the book itself is a pretty entertaining read, but that's a slightly depressing kind of answer to that question about contemporary resonance, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your point about the United Nations, I think, is really very, very, very poignant, because we've sort of lost a recognition of what the organization, the creation of the United Nations meant, and the vision that ended up producing things like Star Trek as a cultural phenomenon. But now, in some ways, the decay of that vision of a united world that would work out its problems, that would avoid war, the decay of that vision is almost total, and at least in the minds of my own students who are young and for whom the opening of the General Assembly, or even just discussing the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights as a foundational document of the United Nations, I mean, they're surprised at that. They don't even know that we haven't signed on, and Cuba, of course, has not either. Both of those being significant because most people don't realize that the biggest part of more than 5 articles of the human rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, is written by one of Cuba's greatest lawyers, who was an author of the 1940 Constitution, at that point the most liberal in the world. And of course, without Eleanor Roosevelt, the United States would not have promoted and garnered the kind of power to the United Nations that it did. So yes, and I think that bears mentioning. I wonder, I mean, we have now some time for questions. We have only one so far. Please, and we invite you to post them under the question and answer section of Zoom. You'll forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name to anyone who might ask a question. The first one comes from Say Bergen, I believe, or Cy Bergen, who thanks us for the event and has a question about Black Power. Cy writes, are there ways that the story of Fidel's September 1960 visit and speech prefigure Black Power politics? Or maybe put another way, is there anything that this microhistory reveals about Black Power's emergence or its politics, even though Black Power won't emerge really for another few years?
Thanks, Say, for that question. It's interesting, I think, really interesting, because the traditional story about Black Power is that it emerges towards the end of the 1960s, 1966, 1967, and that it's something that comes sort of after the civil rights movement or replaces the civil rights movement. I think that Fidel's stay in Harlem kind of strengthens the arguments made by historians who stress the kind of continuities between the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, or see the two operating alongside each other, because it's not just that Fidel meets Malcolm at the Hotel Theresa, but he's also hanging out with Robert F. Williams, who's an NAACP activist from Monroe, North Carolina, but also a proponent of armed self-defense, a guy who a year or so later will end up in Cuba in exile after escaping the United States to flee trumped up kidnapping charges. So, some of the Black activists that Fidel is kind of hanging out with in Harlem are people who are going to be leading, have a really big influence on what becomes the Black Power movement. And also the fact that he's in the North, so as well as the sort of conventional narrative having Black Power come at the end of the 1960s, that same narrative also has, the North only having a civil rights movement once Black Power comes along at the end of the decade. Again, the fact that Fidel is there in Harlem, drawing attention to not just the racial problems of Harlem, but also to the political organizing tradition in Harlem and in the wider city of New York, I think is telling. It kind of tells us that these things were going on much earlier than the sort of traditional history would have us believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just add, and a significant point might be that Malcolm X was really not a nationally known figure when he meets with Fidel Castro, and he would very quickly become one, almost immediately after, not because of Fidel, but because of obviously his own activism. Nonetheless, it is sort of a prophetic kind of a moment for Black Power. So we have a question somewhat about that point and a little bit broader that comes to us from Brazil, from Elio Alves, who writes, thinking about Fidel's political apotheosis, I'd like to know in which ways his visit and stay in Harlem impacted American public opinion. did this episode contribute to building, quote unquote, Fidel Castro's image internationally, I think, within the United States? Positively, negatively, however you might see that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that public opinion in the United States has started to turn against Fidel and the revolution during the early and middle months of 1960. So, Fidel had traveled to America the year before in April 1959 and had a really good reception and a lot of good press. He doesn't get that in September of 1960. He gets relatively poor or hostile press. And really the only area of New York where he's greeted with a lot of support is Harlem. When he travels downtown to visit the Ghanaian mission, for example, he's kind of heckled and kind of booed by passers-by there. So I think general public opinion in the United States, his visit to Harlem, if anything, makes that it doesn't help that situation. If anything, it makes it worse. With the exception of the kind of what's going to become the kind of new left constituency, who do. I mean, they love this stuff. They love the fact that he's gone to Harlem. They love the fact that he's kind of attacking U.S. imperialism. So his standing with them is fine. Internationally, it becomes an iconic trip, and it helps, I think, to cement his global status. And it's people at the time that they just know they all these great photos of the trip. It really, I think, makes an international impression.
Mm-hmm. We have, by the way, a question about the whole event being recorded, and yes, it's being recorded. So if you were unable to attend all of it, you will have this available to you afterwards. We have a question here that's from an anonymous attendee, but it's a significant one, given that the book is titled 10 Days in Harlem. So which day of the 10 days is most important, or most interesting is actually the one. That's
a good question, isn't it? How to choose what's the most interesting day. I mean, I think that, the Monday the 19th of September is a good one, because that's the day when you have Khrushchev arriving in New York and you have Fidel storming out of the Shelburne and ending up at the Theresa. But I think my favorite day is Thursday, September the 22nd. That's a great day because you have Eisenhower gives his speech at the General Assembly in the morning. He then hosts a lunch for the leaders of the Latin American delegations, with the exception of Fidel.
Right.
So Fidel, who's always much more nimble than Eisenhower, instead goes back to the Theresa and treats 12 black employees at the hotel to lunch. Make sure all the press are there to take the photographs, and makes a big thing about how he's much more honored to be dining with the humble people of Harlem rather than the imperialist president of the United States. And then that evening, there's this reception at the ballroom, which is a kind of an early example of what's going to be known as sort of radical chic. And you've got everybody who's anybody from sort of literary, cultural, political Harlem or New York who's there, sort of fawning over Fidel. The Magnum photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson is there, snapping away with his camera, taking photographs. So I think that's my favorite day, and I guess probably also the most interesting. But they're all brilliant, so it's hard to choose.
It is. I've always said this in my classes, but it's very interesting to me how the hypocrisy of the United States was always so great that Fidel really didn't have to make anything up. He might have been an opportunist, etc., and a dramatist, but he never had to make anything up. The material was always just being provided. Well, we have other questions of interest that I want to get to. One of them is much more of a nerdy historian's question that I share as well, and that is from Jesus Sanjuro, sorry. He asks, in a history like this one, how did you choose your sources, given that the number of sources are so numerous? What was your approach to selecting them and finding your own voice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I used a lot of State Department sources, particularly cables from the embassy in Havana about the trip. I thought they were a very interesting insight, particularly into the way that the Americans were viewing what was going on in September 1960. I also used a lot of Cuban radio broadcasts that were available in translation through that had been collected by the State Department, and they were really, really interesting. And I used them alongside a couple of Cuban newspapers. It was, in terms of finding my own voice, I mean, I had a lot of really great material to use. So it was just a way of trying to assemble them, I suppose, into a narrative that I thought would be kind of compelling and engaging. And I think, in a way, I was helped by the structure because it was a book about such a short period of time. It gave me a kind of a very clear structure, I suppose, a clear kind of scaffolding on which to kind of hang the narrative.
I want to. Oh, sorry. I want to ask this question, which I actually find useful for my own reasons. Somebody who's studying and has written recently about this. It'd be interesting to hear your reaction to it in addition to my own. This person asked about the highs, if you could comment on the highs and lows of the relationships between Black Power and Fidel in the years after his visit. And so, in terms of background, you've already mentioned, there was almost immediately a sense that Cuba was an asylum for those who were suffering persecution by the FBI, and efforts to really dismantle the radical voices of the civil rights movement, including that of Robert Williams, who had just written a bestseller called Negroes with Guns. A lot of us should read that because it's a fascinating inversion of how we now perceive who are the bad guys and who has guns, and in general, those who are repressing the civil rights, new version of the civil rights movement in the United States, young white teenagers in some cases, as it turns out. But surely in Cuba, and this is not the topic of your book, but surely in Cuba, there was, a kind of capping off of the potential for a similar version of an anti-racist civil rights movement within the revolution, when Fidel in February of 62, ends that possibility by saying that there was no longer any racism in Cuba, and that racism in Cuba was based on class oppression. So eliminating that had then eliminated sort of the space and need for there to be more, right? So nonetheless, there's this really long legacy to the image of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution as a Black Power space. And so I wonder how you would react to that question of what is the legacy? What are the highs and lows of that relationship between the Black Power movement and struggle for Black rights and the revolution, Fidel himself, after his visit?
Yeah. So I mean, for much of the rest of the decade, Cuba is seen as a kind of as an ally of the Black freedom struggle, and particularly of the Black Power movement. And you have the series of these high profile kind of conferences or congresses that take place in Havana, which bring together freedom fighters, anti-imperialists from all around the global South, and African American activists, particularly Black Power activists. So you have people like Stokely Carmichael and Angela Davis who visit Cuba, who are kind of inspired by what they see in Cuba, who are offer their, see as kind of solidarity between Cuba and the African American freedom struggle. So it retains that sort of allure, if you like, or that relationship. Interestingly, one of the lows is ultimately with Robert F. Williams, because he goes to Cuba in exile, and then he later leaves. He goes to ends up in Beijing, in China, and he writes a letter to Fidel where he basically says, I still like you, I still love you, right? You're still my comrade. And I still support your revolution, but everything I tried to do in Cuba on the race question was undermined. you know, I didn't get money out that I was promised. There was interference. He broadcast a Radio Free Dixie, a radio program to the United States from Cuba. He said there was political interference in the programming. You know, I was undermined, and this was, you know, what you were saying about class. It's because the revolutionary line in Cuba becomes, you know, it's about class and it's about nationalism, and it's not about race. And race is seen as a thing which is divisive to that project. And you know, Robert Williams leaves Cuba and he says, you know, I'm not prepared to be a sort of socialist Uncle Tom, basically. So that's the low point in that relationship, I think. It's quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, the Cuban government, according to Robert Williams' private correspondence, was limiting the transmission of his radio signal to just the station. And then he was being constantly surveilled by the guards of the state security. You know, nonetheless, the legacy is intense. You know, I wondered, and we only have a couple more minutes, but, you know, Fidel returns to Harlem and gives a speech at the Riverside Church during the Clinton administration, the Clinton years. He wears a business suit. You remember all this, or are you too young? Yeah, you know, and I remember, I mean, I was so encouraged to go by my friends, and I made the right move, because he ended up speaking for something like 6.5 hours, and then everybody in the Riverside Church was like, you know, caught. Nobody could leave. So it is, I almost want you to talk about where you think the image, and you've got like 1 minute and 30 seconds, but where you think the image of Fidel remains, perhaps in the Black community of the United States, or in the third world global South today. You know, how would you, what's the barometer there?
Yeah, I can only really answer that question with an anecdote, which was that when I was doing some of the research for the book, I went to the Hotel Theresa. I felt like I had to go there and see it, and it's now been turned into offices, so it's called the Theresa Towers, I think, officially. And anyway, I was taking photographs, and I walked into what used to be the lobby of the Hotel Theresa, and there was a woman there, African-American woman on security, and I explained that I was writing this book, and she was like, yeah, I know all about that. I know about Fidel coming here, meeting Malcolm. It's a great thing. She took my photograph for me there in the lobby. So it was just a small indication, I guess, of the cultural afterlife of that moment. That it's still part of the iconography and the kind of folklore, and it's still there.
Yeah, and it speaks to the importance and relevance of your work. Thank you so much to all of you who joined us, and to my hosts at Politics and Prose for inviting me to participate, and especially to Simon Hall for this wonderful book. I hope everyone reads it. So thank you. I think we're at 2.
Just about. Thank you very much, Lillian and Dr. Hall. That was an excellent discussion. Just want to remind everyone for a few minutes while you still can, link is available in the chat to purchase a copy of 10 Days in Harlem. And before we do wrap up, I had one last question. If you would like to answer, you could also do so, Lillian. But Simon, we always ask our authors if there's anything you're currently reading, or if there's something you are about to start reading, and could you share that with us, what it is?
I think what I'll do, partly because it was a book that I first encountered in Politics and Prose, a book that came out quite a few years ago now, and it was one of the books that kind of inspired me a bit when I was writing this book, 10 Days in Harlem, and it's by a guy called Peter Carson, and it's called K Blows Top. And it's a great book, it's very entertaining, and it's basically a history of Khrushchev's visit to the United States in 1959. And I thought it was just a brilliant book. Again, it's a kind of a micro history that tells a bigger story about the Cold War. So I would definitely recommend that book.
Excellent.
Well, I'll give you an answer. I'm reading a lot lately for my own work, but I have recently returned to that moment of the 60s with a memoir, which is very unusual, two memoirs, one of which I read many times, but it's called Black Man in Red Cuba. And it's a very interesting book published in 64. We should read that. And then another book, which is a memoir by the Chilean ambassador, President Allende's appointee to Cuba, and who gets kicked out by Fidel. The book's author is Jorge Edwards, and it's called Persona Non Grata. And that one, like a lot of Simon's book, reads kind of like a movie script. I mean, it's so visual that you can really feel the texture of the velvet curtains and such. So I would recommend we read these. Old books are good books too.
Well, once again, thank you both for this wonderful time. And thank you everyone who attended this event. And we hope to see you again at another upcoming PNP Live event. Hope you all have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.